Hello, welcome to our event. Thank you for joining us. It is a pleasure to welcome you to our event honoring President Dwight D. Eisenhower's commencement address at Dartmouth and to celebrate Constitution Day, which is coming up on September 17th. I'm Jason Barabas, the director of the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy and the Social Sciences, and a proud member of the class of 1993 at Dartmouth. Today, however, we're going to go even farther back in time. Let's start in the early 1980s. The Rockefeller Center opened its doors in the fall of 1983 to honor the legacy of Nelson A. Rockefeller, a member of the class of 1930 who served 4 terms as governor of New York before becoming vice president during the Ford administration. We hope to highlight Rocky's anniversary throughout the year, but I'm delighted to welcome you to the inaugural event of that celebration. President Eisenhower's 1953 commencement address occurred at a key moment in time, early in his 2-term presidency, and at a moment when the world was consumed with the US-USSR relations and the Red Scare in particular. You will hear a lot more about that era and the context in which Eisenhower urged Dartmouth students not to join the book burners. By that, he meant anyone should be free to exchange ideas, and we shouldn't run from those themes at all. And those things remain important still today. Importantly, from 1953 to 54, Nelson Rockefeller served as the Deputy Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare for the Eisenhower administration. So there's some direct linkages between Rockefeller and Eisenhower as well. Members of the class of 53 are in Hanover now for their reunion, and they helped us put on this event. And I'm going to say a lot more about the 53s in just a moment. Our main part of the event features a speaker, Professor Hitchcock from the University of Virginia, who's written extensively about the Eisenhower administration. I'm going to introduce Professor Hitchcock in a moment, but I want to take this opportunity to welcome the class of 1953 back to campus for the reunion and to thank them for helping us make all of this possible. I want to specifically thank Richard Fleming and Donna Riley for their help and assistance, and also to represent the class of 1953 and to give us a sense of the atmosphere when Ike spoke to the graduates, we have Richard Kahn. Richard C. Kahn practiced law on Long Island for 60 years, appearing at all levels of state and federal courts, including the Supreme Court. He taught continuing legal education courses, served as an adjunct professor at Touro Law School, and he was also a member of the Adelphi University Board of Trustees, as well as being the president of the Suffolk County Bar Association. He's the author of Making Law, a memoir of good times, published in 2020, and he and his wife Vivian moved to the Hudson Valley early in 2019. Richard and I have met several times over the last few months, and he's going to give us a sense of what that day was like with Ike in 1953. Then I will come back to introduce our speaker and moderator from the history department. Richard, I want to turn it to you and let you say a few words on behalf of the class of 53.
Thank you very much, Jason. The class of 1953 welcomes you all, and we particularly enjoy and appreciate the welcome that the Rockefeller Center has given to us and facilitated this event. As co-sponsors, we are very proud to be here today. And by the way, we wish Rocky happy anniversary, 40th anniversary, I understand, this month. I've been asked a lot, and I think you mostly all know that there was a special relationship between our class and the 34th president. I'd like to tell you how it came about. First, I think we should go back to September 1952. That was when our senior year began. Most of our class had reached their 21st birthday and were primed to cast their first votes for president of the United States less than 2 months later. The Dartmouth, the oldest college newspaper in America, by the way, was soon to play a significant role in this story. In those days, there was no radio station WTSL, no Valley News, and the Dartmouth Review was not even a twinkle in anyone's eye. Our teletype at the Dartmouth in Robinson Hall clacked away 24/7, and we turned out a printed newspaper covering campus, local, national, and world news and sports 6 days a week, which was quite unusual for a college newspaper in those days. Because of those circumstances, virtually everybody in the Upper Valley read the D, as it was playfully called. When the paper did something unusual, it commanded attention. And it surely was unusual in 1952, when on each of two successive beautiful fall foliage days, an editorial was published at the top of the Dartmouth's front page. The first supporting Adlai Stevenson, and the second headlined a dissenting opinion supporting Dwight Eisenhower. Some readers scratched their heads and thought that overnight the paper had retracted the Stevenson endorsement. But that was not true. The 9 editors of the paper were split. 8 were in favor of the paper endorsing Eisenhower, and 1 was in favor of supporting Adlai Stevenson. That 1 was Brock Brower, an outstanding member of our class who sadly is no longer with us. As the paper's editor-in-chief, Brock got to choose whom it would support. So Brock had his say, and we had ours. And between us, we certainly had everybody's attention. Then, history professor Alan Foley, who's memorized in one of the Big Green songs we heard sung last night, made sure that we were fully immersed in the election campaign. And he arranged a debate in our required Monday night Great Issues class between supporters of Ike and supporters of Stevenson. The audience, including a number of faculty members, in addition to our class members, crammed 105 Dartmouth. You remember that auditorium well, I'm sure. And Professor Foley was very happy. Then, in March 1953, after the election, of course, in Eisenhower's election, it was announced that the new president would be at our commencement. And that created a new wave of campus excitement, particularly among our classmates, as you can imagine. The graduation exercises would be removed from the bema, which was the traditional setting, to the lawn in front of Baker Library to accommodate a crowd that was expected to reach 10,000. But as has been already mentioned, the events before our commencement day, played out against a stark background. During the period since Eisenhower's swearing in January, Senator Joseph McCarthy and his anti-communist campaign dominated the headlines. He continued to employ fear and intimidation, and usually in the form of fabricated disloyalty accusations against targets that he considered easy marks. In April, as part of that campaign, his aides Roy Cohn and G. David Shine had traveled to American embassies abroad, threatening and pressuring embassy personnel to remove from their libraries books by authors whom Cohn and Shine claimed were communist sympathizers or just plain un-American by their views. The forced removal of their books would only be the beginning of the personal agony that those authors and their families would soon be publicly subjected to. Among the books removed were The Thin Man by Dashiell Hammett and Poems by Langston Hughes. Books by another clearly subversive American writer were also on McCarthy's removal list. He went by the name of Mark Twain. He couldn't be persecuted before McCarthy's Senate committee, however, as he had inconveniently died 40 years before. In Hanover, June 14th finally arrived. The day before, the president had stood in his open car, waving to excited crowds as his motorcade passed by on Wheelock Street. And now we graduating seniors were marching in fully robed to our seats in front of Baker Library. The president and two other honorary degree recipients, Judge Joseph Proskauer of New York and John J. McCloy, Ike's long-term friend, were already seated on the platform. In Rauner Library, there are two memos, one by Dartmouth's librarian Richard Morin and the other by President John Dickey, that tell us what happened next. Judge Proskauer mentioned to the president that he was disturbed by the coerced withdrawal of books from American libraries in Europe. The president said he didn't believe that kind of censorship was going on. Because embassy book banning activities had already been the subject of several published articles by respected journalists like the Times' James Reston, it seems clear, at least to me, that Eisenhower may have well been dissembling, possibly as a way to encourage Proskauer, a well-informed and respected public figure outside of the federal establishment, to provide him with a fresh perspective on the subject, about which the president was already not only informed, but troubled. And in fact, Proskauer greeted the president's remark with an expression of skepticism. But at first he said nothing. Delicate situation. A moment later, however, he turned and said, "Mr. President, I think you were wrong about that." And then John J. McCloy, Ike's longtime friend, indicated Proskauer's right. "Well, that could be," said Eisenhower. Proskauer then mentioned that a book by Vera Michaels Dean had been removed from U.S. libraries in Germany. Now, Vera Dean was a widely respected political scientist in America at that time, perhaps even the Madeleine Albright of that time. But she had become a target of McCarthy, undoubtedly, at least in my opinion, because in her recently published book, recent to our graduation several months before, she published a book called Foreign Policy Without Fear. And she had deplored the current political climate where any American who does not agree 100% with a given set of doctrines can be called subversive. The president listened attentively to Proskauer's comments and then said, "But who is removing the books?" Proskauer replied, "The State Department." Eisenhower said, "Oh," and he sat back in his chair and he turned his head away from the two men. Proskauer realized that continuing this discussion might well be embarrassing to the president. So he said nothing. But Eisenhower then unexpectedly turned back to Proskauer and McCloy and said, "You know, I'm going to speak somewhere later today, and I might be able to say something about my disapproval of book burning." At that point, Proskauer, to his everlasting glory, said, "Mr. President, if you are going to speak out against book burning, the time and place is to do it here and now at Dartmouth in front of this library." That's why I have said, others have said, that Baker Library and Dartmouth were important factors in Eisenhower deciding to make those remarks on that day and at this place. And so he did. And when he did and sat down, Proskauer turned to him and said, "Mr. President, you have double thanks from Mr. McCloy and me." There's a lot more to the story and its aftermath that I'll leave to others to tell, except to add my personal comment, if you'll indulge me. The President of the United States delivered these historic remarks without first turning to political advisors to check whether they thought it was expedient for him, the president, to deliver them. I suggest that that tells us a great deal about the personal instincts, the determination, and the high principles of the man we discuss today. Thank you for coming, and I'm happy to turn the platform back to Jason.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was very eloquent and informative. I really appreciate it. I'm sure a lot of other people who care a lot about Dartmouth really like the way you made that linkage. And I also want to say too that there was a plaque just installed outside of Baker Library that commemorated this moment. So I urge people to go see that at next time they're passing by Baker in the front. So that'll be great. I should say, in moving on with the program here, we are not the only ones interested in this era. So in a bit more of a lighthearted tone, two of the top movies this summer were Barbie and Oppenheimer. They have direct links to the 50s. The first Barbie doll was released in the late 1950s, and key scenes from Oppenheimer are actually from the early 1950s when his security access was being challenged due to, in part, concerns about his loyalty to the United States. So, all of this could not be more timely, and we're not the only ones to be still concerned with these issues today. Let's move to the main part of our event, and let me introduce our speaker and moderator as well. Our guest today is a true delight to welcome here. William Hitchcock is the James Madison Professor of History at the University of Virginia. He has written and edited numerous books on the politics and diplomacy of the 21st century, particularly the era of the World Wars and the Cold War itself. He received his BA degree from Kenyon College in 1986 and his PhD degree from Yale in 1994. He has been a Fulbright Scholar, a Fellow of the Nobel Institute in Oslo, and a holder of the Kissinger Chair at the Library of Congress. His 2008 book, The Bitter Road to Freedom, The New History of Liberation of Europe, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and a winner of the George Lewis Beard Prize for the American Historical Association. His most recent book is the one we're gathered here to discuss, The Age of Eisenhower and America and the World in the 1950s, which appeared on the New York Times bestseller list. And I want to make an important point of connection here. Professor Hitchcock's father and grandfather both graduated from Dartmouth. So I could hardly hope for somebody who is both has a Dartmouth connection, but also an expert in this particular area as well. We welcome you virtually to Dartmouth. Moving on, our moderator is Ed Miller, an associate professor of history and Asian studies, and also the chair of the Department of Asian Societies, Cultures, and Languages. Professor Miller holds a BA from Swarthmore and a PhD from Harvard University. His research and teaching focus on modern Vietnam, the Vietnam War, and oral history. It includes publications such as Misalignments, No Jing Jum's in the United States and the Fate of South Vietnam, as well as the Vietnam War documentary reader. Professor Miller is at work on a book-length study of the Vietnam War in the Mekong Delta, drawing upon archival sources, interviews, and other materials collected both from US and Vietnam. Professor Miller is also co-editing a forthcoming volume in Cambridge History of Vietnam War. We're going to hear more from Professor Hitchcock, and then we'll turn it over to Professor Miller, who will moderate the event before opening up to the audience. And I should say also, you should use the Q&A function in the webinar to pose questions. But for right now, let's move on to the main event. Professor Hitchcock, welcome to Dartmouth College, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Wow, thank you so much. What an introduction. And those remarks from Richard were just fabulous, just wonderful detail, the way he painted a picture of the moment. I'm going to just try to live up to that standard that he's set, which was so impressive. And I really am very grateful to you all for asking me to come. To the class of 1953, thank you indeed for inviting me and for this really wonderful honor of being able to be part of this great day in which you're honoring Eisenhower and his his famous remarks of June of 1953. To Jason, to Bob and Joanne and everybody who made this possible, to Ed Miller and all of you, thank you very much. I just want to say, I am brokenhearted that I'm not with you. I had my first bout of COVID after being very, very careful for many years, and it just absolutely floored me. So believe me, it's not great, but it's better for you that you're not close to me at this moment. So I apologize, and I can only say that as a regular New Hampshire visitor, every summer I'm in New Hampshire, maybe we can do it again sometime soon. Well, you're gathered there, and I'm joining you virtually to mark this important moment in the history of Dartmouth College, in the history of the Eisenhower presidency, in the history of the country, I think. That sunny, brilliant day, I know that rain was forecast, but it turned out to be a gorgeous day, June 13, 1953, with the graduating class and the faculty and their families and friends all sitting in those 10,000 carefully arranged chairs on the lawn in front of Baker Library. What a scene it must have been. And something took place, something unplanned, something impromptu, but also something very deliberate. And it remains as important to us today as it was to the country in 1953. Now, look, it's not a state secret that most graduation addresses are forgettable. And, it's hard to give a memorable speech. Students at graduation, of course, are always thinking about, their family, and they're thinking about the parties they're going to have that night, and they're anxious about the future. So they're not usually concentrating on the graduation speaker. Well, your class of 1953 heard a memorable address, and I am sure none of you have forgotten the message that President Eisenhower brought to you on that day. Well, what exactly did he say? Why did he say it? And what does it mean to us today, 70 years on? So to answer those questions, I want to do three things in my brief remarks. I want to remind you a little bit about the context of 1953, what was going on in the world and at home that might have weighed on Eisenhower's shoulders. Second, I want to talk about the content of his address. And I want to talk about Eisenhower's overall record in confronting McCarthyism. And at the end, I just want to say a few words about what Ike's message means to us still today, all these years later. Well, first, the broader context. So Eisenhower came to Dartmouth early in his presidency. He had been elected in November 1952. He took office in January 1953, so just 6 months before his Hanover visit. Well, now, the election of 1952 had actually been a fairly nasty one. The Democrats attacked Eisenhower because of his lack of experience. Allegedly, he was lazy. Allegedly, it was big corporate titans who were pulling the strings behind him. He was just a ventriloquist dummy. He had no brains, et cetera, et cetera. They went pretty low pretty early. The Republicans, of course, attacked the Democrats for 20 years of socialism from 1933 to 1953, 20 years of the New Deal, socialism, the dictatorship of the state. America had become a one-party state. The Democrats kept getting elected. This was a kind of dictatorship, and so forth. So when people tell you about how wonderful politics was back in the olden days, when we weren't so polarized, don't believe them. At election time, we're always polarized, and we were in 1952. Eisenhower won, of course, a huge victory over Adlai Stevenson. Stevenson was the governor of Illinois. He was the hero of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. Now, Adlai Stevenson has gone down in history as a decent, wise figure, a man of great learning. He had a progressive vision for America. But it's worth noting that Adlai Stevenson had as his running mate Senator John Sparkman of Alabama, who was an outspoken segregationist. Back then, the Democrats' base was in the South, and so the Democratic ticket reflected the fact that their party was divided between the rural segregationist South and the urban, more liberal North. And that division would prove fatal, and it would lead to the dramatic realignment of the Democratic Party in the 1960s. But Stevenson's dilemma reminds us of a very important point. In 1953, the United States had not yet begun to address its racial divide. Segregation of public spaces and schools and facilities was still the norm. The civil rights movement was only just starting to challenge the structures of racism and white supremacy through the courts. Now, many of the key decisions to desegregate public space would occur during Eisenhower's time in office. So that's one thing to keep in mind in the background. In addition to this race problem, Eisenhower confronted a growing and lethal Cold War and an arms race. On November 1st, 1952, just a few days before the presidential election, the United States tested its first hydrogen bomb. And up to that point, this was the largest explosion ever detonated by man. An 80-ton device blew up the entire Pacific atoll it had been built on. It was 500 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And as if this awesome destructive power wasn't enough to keep Eisenhower awake at night, when he became president, his advisors told him, Mr. President, bad news. If the Soviets should launch a nuclear strike against us using airplanes, a whole fleet of bombers with nuclear bombs on board, there's really nothing we can do to stop it. We're just not prepared. We don't have the technology. And since Eisenhower knew, and the country knew, that America in 1953 was at war in Korea, well, the possibility of a global war did loom in the back of his mind, as it did in the minds of many Americans. So this was a dangerous time, an anxious time. But surely the most acute domestic political problem in the mid-1953, as Eisenhower came to Hanover, was McCarthyism. That is, this scurrilous, unfounded attacks made upon citizens of the United States by a sitting Senator, Joe McCarthy of Wisconsin, who, as of 1953, when the Republicans took the Senate, became the chairman of the Government Operations Committee of the Senate and of the Subcommittee on Special Investigations. Now, McCarthy, as you will all keenly remember, abused his power to accuse countless government employees and Army officers and State Department officials, of course, his own political, enemies, of belonging to, quote, a conspiracy so immense as to dwarf any previous such venture in the history of man. I mean, he always swung for the fences with his statements. He alleged that there existed a gigantic underground apparatus of communists in America who were trying to destroy the country, trying to destroy the US government. And he used the media, which loved a good controversy, to launch his allegations and his fantastical rumors. Now, a very important point to remember is that the practice that we call McCarthyism actually had been going on for a long time before McCarthy adopted it. Americans had a long history of hating and fearing communism. That goes back to the days right after World War I, when communism seemed so dangerous and so expansive. Well, during the 1930s, too, as communists were making inroads into the labor unions of the country and into other front organizations, well, the federal government grew anxious about that. The FBI began investigating communists. The US Congress created the investigative committee called HUAC, House Un-American Activities Committee, in 1934. Yes, not in the 50s, in the 30s. And it began a notorious anti-communist witch hunt in 1938. And after World War II, it was discovered that US atomic secrets had actually been shared with the Soviets by a Soviet spy ring working in the United States. So the government went even further in probing domestic communists. And in 1948, a young congressman from California, Richard Nixon, made a national reputation for himself for the way he interrogated Alger Hiss, who was an alleged communist agent. Nixon seemed to catch Hiss in a web of his own lies. And Nixon was so good at red hunting that the Republican Party selected him to be Ike's running mate in 1952. So the country was accustomed to anti-communism and not only tolerated it, but actually had welcomed it up to a point. And certainly Eisenhower, as both a candidate and a president, didn't want to take these threats, these concerns, these security threats lightly. He knew that US secrets had illegally been stolen, and he did not want to be the president who was caught napping while the communists penetrated into the government and our military secrets. Now, there are ways to go about conducting security investigations without compromising civil rights and civil liberties of American citizens. Joe McCarthy, of course, did not play by that rule book. His accusations were designed with only one thing in mind: publicity. He was trying to make a name for himself as a great patriot, a truth teller He had fought the enemy in World War II. He liked to call himself Tail Gunner Joe. He would keep fighting communists in the Senate. He loved the notoriety. He loved the power. He loved the attention and the controversy that swirled around him. And from 1950 to 1954, it looked as if nothing could stop him from using accusations of communism to destroy the lives of many public figures. So it was a sad time, an anxious time, as federal and state governments, businesses, universities, Hollywood studios, they were all starting to close their doors to people who had been tarnished by the brush of McCarthy's baseless accusations. So what about the book burning itself? Well, as Richard has talked about, in the spring of 1953, the chief lawyer of McCarthy's committee, Roy Cohn, along with his special friend, David Schein, they went on this tour of U.S. Information Service libraries in Europe, Paris, Frankfurt, Bonn, Munich, a few other places in Europe. And at each one, they theatrically demanded to know, where are you keeping the communist authors or their books? And the librarians would say, well, golly, I don't think we have any of those. And then Cohn would say, what about Dashiell Hammett? And the mystery writer, now Hammett had been involved in the Communist Party of the 1930s. And the librarian would say something like, well, we do have the Maltese Falcon. Is that what you're after? And Cohn would shout, ha ha, you see, the place is riddled with communists. And then he would have a press conference and off he would go to the next library. So it was a scam. It was a circus act. And the press who was covering it kind of knew they were being taken, but they reported it in great detail. Now, it was not clear that any books were in fact burned. It's possible some embassy officials destroyed some printed material in the wake of Cohn's rampage through the U.S. overseas libraries, but the term book burning became a figurative description of Cohn and McCarthy's effort to use innuendo to create an anti-communist panic to attack the left in America. It's no wonder that Eisenhower would have been appalled at all this. It ran against his own sense of decency and fairness. He loathed the tactics that were deployed by McCarthy and Roy Cohn, and he thought, quite rightly, that they brought shame on the reputation of the United States in the world. So when he came to that rostrum, the great big pine stump that you use as at your graduations, which I love, when he came to the rostrum on June 13, 1953 at Dartmouth, this was an issue. This was an issue clearly on his mind, perhaps more so than nuclear war or race relations. And it was, of course, appropriate to speak about the freedom of intellectual inquiry in front of Baker Library at one of America's great colleges. And Eisenhower understood the meaning of the moment. Well, when he began to speak that day, it was pretty clear that he didn't really have a fixed plan in his mind. I mean, I don't know about you, but if I have to speak in front of 10,000 people, I'm going to know what I'm going to say, right? But no, Ike is he's too collected for that. He gets up and he rambles for a while, and then he found his theme. And he said he wanted to talk about two things. Maybe you remember what they were. His first point was classic Ike, fun. He wanted to talk about fun. He said, if you succeed in life without enjoying your work, you'll be a failure. The crucial thing in life is to find work you love, find recreation that keeps you alive and healthy and in touch with the pleasures of life. Now, you may know that Eisenhower constantly took a ton of flack from the media for his many golf games and his fishing trips and his going to Augusta National with all of his buddies. But his position was, if you don't have fun in life, you will be unproductive and gradually you'll destroy yourself. So find the joy in life first. Everything else will follow. And I think that's a wonderful message, and I'm sure it resonated among the students. But his second point that was about courage. That's the word he used. It was about courage. He said, to make a difference in life, you need courage. There will be testing times when, you can cower with the herd, take the easy road, compromise your values, or you can summon up the courage to do the hard thing and do the right thing. Courage, he was saying, is a learned habit. It's a character trait you have to develop. Once you meet some of life's tests with courage, you'll inspire others. And that, for Eisenhower, was the core of leadership. So have the courage to be critical and work to improve America, he said. He cited the terrible reality of racial discrimination. The U.S., he said, is not perfect. We must work to do better. And then he uttered that remarkable passage. Don't join the book burners. Don't think you're going to conceal faults by concealing evidence that they ever existed. Don't be afraid to go in your library, read every book, as long as that document does not offend your own ideas of decency. That should be the only censorship. Wow, what did Ike mean exactly? I think he wanted to convey this important message. Don't join the cynics, the anti-intellectuals, the fear-mongers, the haters. Instead, be open-minded, be gracious. Read books, don't burn them. Develop your own critical faculties so you can take on ideas you disagree with. Engage, argue, but don't turn away. Don't try to hide and condemn out of ignorance. It was a remarkable statement, and of course, in the context, it made national news, and it rightly stands as a brief encapsulation of Eisenhower's core values: to have the courage to engage with the world, not to fear it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's not assume that this was the end of McCarthy or McCarthyism. No, it was just the kind of crisis moment of McCarthyism. Unfortunately, Eisenhower did not go much further than that general statement he made at Dartmouth. To his friends privately, he said, "I refuse to name him directly. That would give him the attention he wants so desperately. I'm not going to wage a personal battle with a senator over this." So he didn't want to personalize the conflict between Eisenhower and McCarthy. It was not until 1954, when McCarthy began to make accusations about communists having penetrated, of all places, the United States Army, that Eisenhower began to act. During 1954, his administration waged a quiet, behind-the-scenes struggle. They started releasing damning information to the press about Roy Cohn and McCarthy, and they did it secretly, back channel. Actually, Sherman Adams, who probably was responsible for Eisenhower being at Dartmouth, was the guy who was actually pulling the levers of the anti-McCarthy crusade now. And eventually, the accusations were such that the Senate itself launched an investigation into McCarthy and his allegations. And so those hearings, the so-called Army McCarthy hearings, well, they were aired on television. Some of you probably remembered seeing them. And finally, the nation saw what a wretched and angry and unstable bully McCarthy really was. And at the end of the year of 1954, the Senate finally found itself and voted to censure McCarthy, although 22 Republican senators voted against the censure resolution. And that's a reminder, up until the bitter end, about half of the Republican Party backed Joe McCarthy. So Eisenhower's record on McCarthyism is actually a little mixed. On the one hand, we know he personally loathed McCarthy and the kind of smears and innuendo and guilt by association that McCarthy used to climb up, to notoriety. We know that behind the scenes, Eisenhower did a lot to discredit and undermine McCarthy. But we also know that Eisenhower really did not want to tangle with McCarthy personally, and his remarks at Dartmouth were notable precisely because they were so rare. The graduation speech was a brief little opening in the Eisenhower armor, reminding us that he felt passionately about the subject, but also that, he'd sort of lowered his guard a little bit. He allowed the public to see that McCarthyism had actually gotten under his skin. Eisenhower didn't want to fight McCarthy directly, so in the end, he used the old-fashioned beltway politics to weaken McCarthy, using a little dirt to smear McCarthy, to undermine him, and let the long, slow process of the hearings unfold, fatally damaging McCarthy, as Eisenhower knew they would. Yet for all that, we know in large part because of the Dartmouth Address that Eisenhower's values were squarely in the right place. In his remarks, he asked Dartmouth students, he asked you, class of 1953, and by extension, the country, to be confident about the strength and durability of our own political system. We can handle difficult problems without censorship, he was saying. He urged students to read, to think, to question, to seek insight and understanding. Doing that, he argued on that day, was the only way to make ourselves better advocates of democracy. So in closing, I just want to end by asking what Eisenhower's speech might mean to us, to you today, 70 years since he gave it. Well, I think it's obvious to you, and it seems obvious to me, that we need this message now more than ever. Our country has always placed freedom of expression and freedom of inquiry at the heart of our public life. It's the thing that every society around the world has long admired about the United States, the freedom to speak, to read, to ask questions. Eisenhower knew that if government should use its power to bully, to intimidate, to stifle free exchange of ideas between opposing points of view, our democracy would suffer. Without the freedom to think, to speak, and learn, we cannot sustain democracy. And ladies and gentlemen, this is what every authoritarian leader knows. They have always known that the place to start when you want to impose a dictatorship is in the universities. Close down the lecture halls, yes. Fire the professors. Fill academia with political henchmen, handpicked to echo the party line. When you see a society that chooses to make war on its universities, you know you're in the grip of an authoritarian revolution, and then it's time to act. Eisenhower, when he came to Hanover, spoke from experience. He had gone to Europe in 1942 at the head of a gigantic Allied force to destroy Nazism. Why? Because it had become clear to Americans that Nazism and fascism were direct dangers to America's freedom and democracy. The Nazi government had made book burning and assaults on university professors and intellectuals and artists and journalists, writers of all kinds, its number one priority, its earliest priority. Just a few months after Hitler took power, he ordered a gigantic bonfire of library books be set alight right in front of the great Humboldt University in Berlin in May of 1933. Eisenhower knew all about the real book burners. He fought with courage and tenacity to destroy that tyranny. When he became president in 1953, he found that there were some, not many, but some in the US also, who wanted to stifle free expression, free inquiry, freedom of conscience, and instead wanted to set themselves up as the arbiters of a new ideology based on fear, intolerance, and hatred. On June 13, 1953, when he spoke to members of the graduating class, he was exhorting you and indeed the whole country to carry on the basic values that his generation, that World War II generation, had given so much to protect and defend. The values of decency, intellectual curiosity, freedom of conscience, and freedom of expression. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope and I believe that because of your efforts to memorialize Eisenhower's remarks, future generations of Dartmouth students will hear that exhortation and guide themselves by it, that famous phrase, don't join the book burners. Thank you very much for your attention and your time. I look forward to your good questions.
Professor Hitchcock, thank you so much for those remarks, and I also have to thank Richard Kahn, who you've already mentioned here, for setting the scene back in 1953 in such a compelling manner. We've got some time here for questions, and we are going to open up to questions both from those members of the audience who are watching online, and also to the members of the class of 53 who are over in the Hanover Inn and watching together there. But before we open the floor, I want to exercise my own privilege as the moderator here to ask you. I think I'm going to limit myself to just one question. There's so many things, Will, that I feel that we could discuss here. But I do want to ask you about the distinction you draw between McCarthy and McCarthyism, and about Eisenhower's mixed record on this, and mixed record in resisting McCarthyism. As you correctly point out, McCarthyism was bigger than McCarthy, right? It's something that begins well before McCarthy, and it even continues after his downfall in 1954. But McCarthyism is also bigger than McCarthy in that McCarthyism was not just all about the sort of high-profile national attacks on figures like Nixon's attack on Alger Hiss. It was also something that was much more pervasive, that spread through the entire federal government and through all of American society, through American institutions, down to the state and local level. There were thousands, if not tens of thousands, of victims of McCarthyism during the 1950s who were teachers, local government officials, librarians, union members, just ordinary Americans who get caught up in the apparatus of investigation and loyalty oaths. And I'm wondering what we think about Eisenhower's role in challenging or not challenging this aspect of McCarthyism, sort of the grassroots elements of it, if you will. McCarthyism, of course, it doesn't start under Eisenhower. The Truman administration had very famously instituted a loyalty program. Mm-hmm. When Eisenhower comes into office, however, he changes that. He institutes a new sort of security program, one that's embodied in Executive Order 10450, which is something that he had signed just a couple of months before he came to Dartmouth to deliver those remarks. And many historians have seen this as sort of shifting the approach to security within the federal government, and by extension elsewhere in U.S. society, shifting it away from a relatively narrow focus on loyalty and whether or not individuals had connections to the Communist Party, and sort of broadening it out into a generalized search for security risks. And under this system, as several historians have shown, you didn't actually have to have connections, prior connections to communists, to be deemed a security risk. If you were deemed to be immoral, if you were accused of being homosexual, you could be deemed a security risk. And several historians have argued that this is something that actually expanded a great deal under Eisenhower's tenure as president. So I'm wondering if you can talk just a little bit about this aspect of McCarthyism and what the implications are for us in thinking about Eisenhower's overall record in this area.
Well, you've summarized it very well, Ed, and I mean, I think this is why I use the term a mixed record. You know, the momentum that had been created from the 1930s, indeed from the 19-teens, the anti-communist, the anti-Bolshevik fear and anxiety in America was deep, and it was widespread. And there were few politicians who could make their careers successful by trying to stand in front of the anti-communist train, if you will. So even though Truman, vetoed some of the more extreme congressional acts, they were overridden because the Congress was so determined to get anti-communist laws and statutes on the books to allow them to do more investigations. So well before Eisenhower came in, this was already a red hot issue. McCarthy himself basically learned who did he learn from? He learned from Nixon. He saw Nixon making a career for himself in the House. And in 1950, McCarthy gave a speech at Wheeling, West Virginia that basically could easily have been given by Richard Nixon. He adopted the Nixonian style. He was just a lot more sloppy and a lot more vulgar about it. And he began to invent his own style, but he learned from Nixon. Now, the fact that Nixon was held out by the Republican Party as the ideal vice presidential candidate for Eisenhower tells you how widespread the anti-communist crusade really was, and that both parties wanted to be seen as being on the right side of the issue. Now, the other thing to remember, and of course, you're absolutely right, you've highlighted a lot of the ways in which McCarthyism was bigger than McCarthy. It penetrated into our society in so many ways. So many people suffered from it, people far removed from the federal government, people in local towns and libraries and so forth. But I think, the question that we have to ask is, did Eisenhower, how should we draw a balance sheet? Did he do anything? Did he do something? Did he do a lot? The pendulum has swung. Over the years, I've given hundreds of Eisenhower talks around the country, and almost every single time I get a question that's usually not a question, but it says something like, I'll never like Eisenhower because he didn't confront McCarthy. And to that I say, basically there's a lot to that. And I understand why you would feel that way, because many of Eisenhower's closest friends felt that way. And they wrote to him in real time, and they urged him to speak out and to speak up. And Eisenhower took a very tactical view, which was, I'm not going to damage the office of the presidency by tangling with a crazy senator that I don't really have the ability single-handedly to deal with. So it was the back channel stuff. It was the releasing of the embarrassing dossiers on McCarthy and Cohen and so forth that worked eventually. Without that, perhaps McCarthy continues and goes on for a much longer period of time. So I would say that the record shows that Eisenhower finally used some of the levers at his disposal to try to light a backfire that damaged McCarthy himself. But he did not stop McCarthyism. And as you say, the executive order is an outrage. That document is an outrage that document was signed. It deliberately persecutes, quote unquote, deviant behavior, gay people, people who are somehow untrustworthy to serve in public office. Well, in retrospect, we look with shame on those acts. But at the same time, I don't think we should throw out the baby with the bathwater. What was the available political move that Eisenhower could do at that time? It's a little bit like the story of his role in Brown v. Board and the appointing of justices to the Supreme Court. Did he do enough? Maybe not. Did he appoint Earl Warren? Yes. Did that lead to Brown versus Board? Yes. So you have to understand the available options as he saw them, and then we can have a conversation about where you would draw the line in your judgment.
Well said. Thank you for that response. As I said, there are many more questions that I could ask of you, but we're already receiving a number from the audience here, so I'm going to turn to those. The first question that we have here comes from Beth Shapiro-Lewicki, who's a member of the Dartmouth class of '81. And she asked, Professor Hitchcock, what lessons learned from President Eisenhower's speech against McCarthyism could we apply to today's arguably even more divisive environment?
Well, I think the thing that I took away from it, and again, this is just the speech. So we're talking about what he said on that day, because it's a wonderful speech. It's available in print, of course, and you can see a video of the entire thing. I want to reemphasize something that I said but may have rushed over, which is that there were two elements to that speech, the notion of fun and the notion of courage. And I wouldn't want you to think the fun part was just him killing the clock. Actually, what he was saying is Americans must recover the joy of public life. And I just want to pause on that for a moment, because in a sense, we have all become incredibly depressed by public life. Dartmouth students want to do good in the world, but they're not quite sure that that means they want to go into politics. Maybe they want to join a nonprofit. Maybe they want to work in community service of some kind. But not too many of them, I will warrant, want to run for office. Why? Because it's no fun. It is no fun. And you can see why it's no fun. It's a brutalizing experience. So when he talked about fun, I don't think he was being frivolous. I think what he was saying is, as Americans, we're the luckiest people, really, honestly, we are among the luckiest people in the world. We forget that, and we focus on all of our faults. We have many faults, but let's not forget the joy about, sharing the American experience together. I think that's one point that he was trying to say. The second thing that I think we should take away from him is that courage is hard. It is really, really hard to stand up and take an unpopular position and to do it in a way that is persuasive. So instead of just saying, I'm taking my marbles and I'm going home and I hate you all, rather to say, I disagree with you and I want to explain why, and I think I want to try to persuade you that we can come to a solution. That takes courage, because you might end up being the only person in the room who feels that way. So I do think that, in a weird way, those two terms, fun and courage, which were the keynotes of his speech, are in some respects characteristic of Eisenhower. I think it's one of the reasons why so many people still hold up Eisenhower as such a popular public figure, even though it's been so many years since he left office and since he died. He remains in numerous polls, the fifth most admired and most effective president in our nation's history. You know, that's pretty good company to be amongst. And I think this issue of his skill set, his integrity, he didn't get things right all the time, but you knew that he had good values. And I think that remains appealing today.
Following up on this last question, I said I was only going to ask one question, but I'm going to cheat a little bit here. Can you talk about the relationship of Eisenhower in the 1950s to what comes afterwards? Because if we look at the period, at least in the early 1960s, right, the late 1960s is a time that many historians have pointed to as also a divisive time in American history, which are in some ways the origins of some of the divisions that are still with us today. But the early 60s is actually a time of, in many parts of American society, a time of great optimism. And also a time of relatively high faith in government. You mentioned today, and I think you're right, students here at Dartmouth are very pessimistic about government, about public life, about careers in public life. But in the early 60s, there was actually at least a moment where that wasn't the case. And I'm wondering if you, as a historian, can try to help us understand sort of that relationship between the 1950s, this period of division that you talked about, as well as McCarthyism, and then the 1960s.
Well, that's an awfully big topic, and I don't want to chew up all of our time thinking through that very good question, but very big question. The one thing I just want to point out, and I know there's always a lot of Kennedy admirers out there, but you know, Kennedy ran for president in 1960 not against Richard Nixon. I mean, he did, but in a way he didn't. He ran against Dwight Eisenhower. And the reason that he did that is because Eisenhower was the perfect foil for Kennedy. Eisenhower was old, Kennedy was young. Eisenhower was a World War II general. Kennedy was lieutenant junior grade in the Navy. Eisenhower was a conservative, Republican. Kennedy thought of himself as a kind of progressive Democrat, though in fact he actually governed quite conservatively. But the keynote was youth. The keynote was a generational change. We're going to bring generational change. We're going to infuse America, which has been asleep for the last 8 years, with wakefulness. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who wrote the famous book, 1,000 Days, right after Kennedy was killed, spoke about the New Deal and the Kennedy years as two wakeful periods, bookending a long, prolonged national nap. And this is how Kennedy used his platform, his prestige, his popularity, was to denounce Eisenhower as old, out of step, boring, dead before he was even out of office, a golf-playing nobody. Now, we all politicians use their predecessor as a bit of a foil, but Kennedy really dug in, and he really enjoyed it. He loved twisting the knife in. And he did Eisenhower's reputation a lot of damage, actually. And it would be about 20 years before the Eisenhower revisionism could begin and sort of improve Ike's reputation. Of course, Kennedy brought dynamism, youth, and intellectual fervor and a degree of sophistication into the White House that really had not been seen in a generation. And the country fell in love with him. But the tragedy of his assassination, 63, up to 1968, and the domestic as well as the international conflicts of 1968, that 5-year period transformed the optimism of the early 60s into something very different, a sense of crisis, of a country coming apart at the seams. And it's no accident that after Kennedy, after Johnson, after Nixon, presidencies that had to deal with domestic upheaval and war abroad, that Eisenhower's reputation started to improve again in the public mind. Oh, Ike, he was actually pretty good. The 50s were actually pretty good. So what happened was a collective amnesia about all of the difficulties that we still had in the 50s, the bitter Cold War, the race problems, the economic doldrums. So there you are, right? Reputations rise and fall, and we sometimes tend to remember selectively the things about the past that we are most fond of. But that's not always the way the historians see things.
And I suppose that part of the rehabilitation of Eisenhower's reputation can also be traced to the emergence of Ronald Reagan and his presidency in the 1980s. Insofar as Reagan was also, at least in part, well, in some ways he was sort of Kennedy-esque. He also talked about it being morning in America, so he was invoking that metaphor of wakefulness. But Reagan was also kind of hearkening back to an earlier period to sort of have this message of sort of getting back to traditional values. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think that's fair. Although I will just say this: the Reagan revolution, some people want to call it, was fundamentally about trying to undermine the role of the federal government in the public life of the country. That was what Reagan ran on. So sure, optimism, morning in America, the 50s were great, but he also ran on a platform of deregulation, de-unionization, and the notion that basically the fat, lazy government had gotten too big and was drowning the initiative of the American people. So we should destroy the government, make it small enough so you could drown it in the bathtub. The scariest words in the English language are, ma'am, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Remember how much mileage he got out of that? That's not Eisenhower. That's not Eisenhower. Eisenhower embraced the New Deal synthesis. He said, we don't want a big government, we want an effective government, and we're going to have one. And he established the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. He raised the minimum wage. He implemented any number of statutes that basically embedded and codified the New Deal. So I would just, point to the rupture as much as the continuities between Reagan and Eisenhower.
So maybe the continuities are more rhetorical than substantive, or at least in the area of policy.
I mean, rhetoric really matters, and Reagan was really good at it. So I think that you're right that he tried to borrow a little bit of the cloak of the Eisenhower era, but as in terms of policy, not so much.
We've got another question here from Chuck. McCarthyism started back in the 30s. When did Trumpism start? There's another big question for you. Who today, academic or political, has the Eisenhower courage to take him on and tell us not to join the book burners?
Well, actually, that's an excellent question. And although it sounds like it's really a contemporary question about today and Trump and the last 5-6 years, whatever, since 2016, I think historians of politics in America have had an opportunity to go back and try to answer that question. Where are the roots of Trumpism? And honestly, and I don't speak for all historians, but I think what I have read and what I've seen in the press and in the thoughtful articles and some books is that there's always been a strain in America. Eisenhower knew it. He talked about it in 1953. There's always been a strain. Some might call it populism, some might call it nativism, some might call it ethno-nationalism, some might call it white supremacy, or some sort of swirling collection of ideas, grievances, resentments that have been present in American public life, essentially since the beginning of the Republic, but especially perhaps in the late 19th, early 20th century, when many of those ideas became codified in political parties emerging in the wake of the Civil War. And our perennial, racial conflict, the inequalities that capitalism has created in America, these kinds of things have a long history, and they have not been far from being resolved over time. They get reintroduced and reinvented and exacerbated for every generation. So one of the things that has changed, one of the ways that the Trump experience has changed me is that I used to be a Whiggish historian. I used to basically think things were always getting better. And I think I've come to see things a little differently, with wisdom perhaps, but nonetheless, I think that things get better and then they're invariably a backlash, a backwash. And it really depends on the action of every generation to how far the backlash is going to go. Will it go all the way back to the beginning, or will it only go 80% of the way? So have you completely lost all your progress? You have to start all over again? Or do you begin from a slightly better position? And that is an open-ended question. So we want a fairer, more just, more inclusive, kinder, gentler society. We don't have it. What's happened? Why haven't we got it? Well, we got to work harder. So to your point of who's going to stand up, I mean, I think lots of people are trying. I really do. I think people are trying to stand up, but it's very difficult to make the case. It shouldn't be, but it is difficult to make the political case for liberalism or progressivism, if you like, or basically, you could even call it Eisenhowerism, because it's an abstract and somewhat intellectual case. Whereas, the populist and the nativist and the ethno-nationalist can do it much more simply with symbols, a flag, a hat, a sense of inclusion, a sense of breaking the taboos. So Trumpism isn't new. Trump is a product of long-running currents in American life that go way back, and we have been awoken to this fact, this deep character in our nation.
As you talk about these long currents, I'm thinking back to the famous book by Richard Hofstadter, a great American historian, about the paranoid style in American politics, and he wrote that book, I think, in the early '60s. So already as a historian, he was looking at the deep history of some of these trends that we see as in their latter-day manifestations today. We have another question here. This comes from my good friend and colleague Bob Bonner in our history department here at Dartmouth. Bob says, "Hi, Will. Are you aware of other presidential college speeches or other college speakers that capture the moment as this one did?" I have my own idea of a candidate for this category, but I'm very interested, like Professor Bonner, to hear how you will answer this, Will.
I mean, you put me on the spot. I'll have to think about it. What's your favorite suggestion?
Well, the one that comes immediately to mind, of course, is George Marshall at Harvard in 1947, right? And where he gives the address.
I thought you'd pick a Kennedy address.
So, what's that?
I thought you were going to pick a Kennedy at American University.
No.
Okay.
I mean, Kennedy probably did give some commencement addresses, but I'm not sure that any of them are quite as famous. But the Marshall one, of course, he sort of floats this testimony of what becomes the Marshall Plan. So that
he wasn't president. That's part of the question, was presidential addresses, but he was Secretary of State. It's an excellent example. And one thing I think to broaden the scope of the question is to remind ourselves, remind the public, remind our audience that as historians, if we study presidencies, we tend to think that the secrets of the president are all hidden, and that the only way to really know what's going on is to have the secret documents that have to be declassified. That's where the real truth lies, right? This is our own blind spot. We believe that the truth happens behind closed doors. It's locked away, but hidden away. As a matter of fact, the more and more we know about more material gets declassified. I've read thousands and thousands of pages of declassified Eisenhower material. It's pretty similar to what has been declassified already. It's similar to what happens in public. And in particular, speeches matter. There may be a speechwriter on the call here, and you will know that a battalion of advisors labors over every speech a president makes. And it's a statement of policy. So public speeches of presidents are a wonderful way to get a sense for what the president really wants to communicate. Sometimes they do it poorly. Sometimes they do it brilliantly. Roosevelt's speechwriters were phenomenal. And right from the very beginning, when he was even running for governor, he had Judge Sam Rosenman helping him to write speeches. He would bring him to the White House and they would work together. By the beginning of the late 30s, early 40s, he had Robert Sherwood and Archibald MacLeish, the poet laureate, for heaven's sakes, on his speechwriting staff. Dorothy Thompson, the famous columnist for the New York Herald Tribune, would write in ideas for speeches, and Roosevelt's team would incorporate them into his speeches. So speeches are not to be dismissed as, well, it's just public posturing. They're often the place the president tries to make the case for a policy. And something like the Marshall Plan, Marshall had so much prestige and freedom that he could say, I'm going to let something rip here at Harvard and see where I go with it. It's not a great rhetorical construction if you actually read what Marshall said, but the press understood he was calling for a dramatic change of American policy.
As you're talking, I did come up with one Kennedy example. The Peace Corps, I believe, was proposed during a speech at the University of Michigan. I can't remember if he was president already or if he was still maybe president-elect, but that's one example for you. I believe that we have a question from the class of '53, and Bob Coates is going to ask this one.
Thanks, Ed. I've got what I think maybe two quick questions. The first is from Aaron Epstein. How do you square the two themes in Eisenhower's speech at Dartmouth, the courage that is necessary in leadership and the tangential, ineffectual way that he confronted McCarthyism? That would be from Aaron.
Well, I tried to get at this a little bit with Ed's very good question at the beginning, which is it's a mixed record. I mean, I guess in a way, what I want to say is I can't square it, and I think this is the reality that we have political leaders who are limited. On the one hand, Eisenhower inspired a generation of Dartmouth students with the notion of political courage and public service. That was appropriate that he did so. On the other hand, he lived in a day-to-day life in which he made tactical decisions on a whole host of political issues that in retrospect, he might have gotten wrong. McCarthyism is probably the most egregious example. But, taken as a whole, did Eisenhower's presidency fall on the right side of, fairness? And taken as a whole, did his presidency improve the country? And I think the answer is yes. The strongest case that I can make for this is his record on civil rights, which is often denigrated by scholars, but which was important, not transformative. No, LBJ's record on civil rights was transformative. Eisenhower's was very important. He was a very important figure. And the reason I mentioned John Sparkman and Adlai Stevenson is because imagine if Stevenson had won and the Democratic Party had been in power in 1953 when Fred Vinson, this Chief Justice, drops dead of a heart attack, and you have to appoint a new Chief Justice. Would Adlai Stevenson, with the Democratic Party constructed the way that it was in the 50s, have appointed a liberal Republican governor and Attorney General of California, Earl Warren? No way. So, these are contingencies, but you have to live in the moment. As historians, we've got to evaluate the available decisions. And in the case of Eisenhower, I think the country was enormously lucky to have a figure of his moderate outlook at a series of crucial turning points in American public life. So he's not perfect, and the record on McCarthyism remains something that even his supporters view as is disappointing. And yet, McCarthyism died at the end of 1954, in part because Eisenhower helped drive in at least one of the knives. It's a little bit like Murder on the Orient Express. There were a lot of people sticking in the knives, and Ike was just one of them.
Ed, one last quick question, and this question is, where do you see Eisenhower's World War II experience and his heroism in his famous speech here at Dartmouth? Well,
I tried to hint to speculate that in some ways, don't join the book burners was a personal thing for him because of his war record in helping to lead the great forces that destroyed Germany, Nazi Germany, and the Hitler regime. In general, generals have made bad presidents. I think we've had 13 of them, and not very many of them have been great. Grant, great general. Most people think his presidency was a difficult one at best, important but difficult. Of course, the role model of all of them was George Washington, and Eisenhower consciously modeled himself on this figure who combined statesmanship with a military past. But it's difficult to make the transition, and not many of the general presidents have been able to make it as well as I think Eisenhower did. It meant that he ran his White House in a certain way, in a certain style. It meant that he delegated things when perhaps he shouldn't have. Maybe he delegated too much on McCarthyism when perhaps he shouldn't have. He tried to get Nixon to go talk to McCarthy and say, cool it. And Nixon did. And McCarthy said, no, I'm not gonna. And he tried to keep the dirt from getting onto him because he was the general officer. He was the guy in charge. He was the president. That's a trait that that carried over, I think, from his time in the military when he didn't want to have the negative blowback. But politics is all about negative blowback. So in some ways, he found, especially early, that he wasn't as well prepared for the dirtiness of the dark arts of politics as he might have been. But I also think that his ability to stand above party and to win support of so much of the country. I mean, he was enormously popular with voters of both parties. That's very rare. And his overall opinion, public opinion polling, his approval rate, on average of 8 years was 65%. Average. I mean, come on. That's not, he didn't do that just by luck. He had a sense of patriotism that transcended his political identity. And Americans responded to that.
So, Professor Hitchcock, we've reached the end of our allotted time here. So I think we're going to need to wrap up this session. But let me just reiterate my thanks and the thanks of the entire Dartmouth community and the Rockefeller Center for your participation in this event today. This has been wonderful. It's been really interesting for me to hear from you and as well from Richard about this important event 70 years ago. And let me just say that we're looking forward to welcoming you to Dartmouth in person, hopefully not too long from now. So
thank you so much. You've been a wonderful moderator and a great audience. Thank you.
And I'll also say thank you to the class of 1953 and congratulations on celebrating your 70th reunion. We should all be so fortunate to celebrate our 70th reunion. So that's no mean achievement. So thanks to the class, thanks to you, and thanks to Rocky for making all of this happen. Take care.